this one, Kodak Retina Reflex type 025. But this could be any retina. It's got a wee problem that's very annoying. Shutter works. Camera's a bit worn, bit tired. But watch this. Cock the shutter. Cock the shutter. Cock the shutter. Any time you do that, you can wind the film on. The film advance is not locking at the end of the advance stroke. So you could chop through an awful lot of film doing that. The camera works, but if you wound it on, put it in your camera bag, pulled it out sometime later, picked it up, swung the film advance, it would move again. You'd have lost the frame. So what's likely to cause that problem? Well, I've got my suspicions. We'll open it up and have a look. First thing I've got to do here is remove the knob from the meter. So what I normally want to do in a case like that is make sure we put it back in the right place. So I'm just going to move that scale right round out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. And what I'm watching for is this little alignment mark there, and I'm rotating the dial all the way clockwise so I can see where that alignment mark comes up to. And it's probably a third of the way in, between the 16 and the 17, closest to the 16. If I put everything back in the same place afterwards, assuming the meter was accurate beforehand, it'll be accurate afterwards. Of course, that would be a pretty exciting assumption. So we'll take that off. I'll put something through the rewind fork, rotate the rewind knob, lift that off, lift off that collar. We've got 3 screws, one at the end, 2 here, and we've got this one. I'll unscrew that one. I'm using the same screwdriver as I used for the screw on the top of the meter. This camera has had a hard life by the looks of it. I'm not 100% certain it's all original. It may be leftover, a combination of leftover bits from other people's repair projects for all I know. Anyway, let's lift this off. Hold my finger on the meter so it doesn't lift off with the top of the camera. Lift the top off. That little rubber pad fell out. That little rubber pad sat down here in the top, and that serves to hold the meter down firmly. We can lift the meter off. And out of the way. These meters, they're located on a little stud and by this little loop of plastic, which is almost always broken, as it is in that case. So let's have a look at the top of the camera. Now this is full of sand and grit. It looks really ugly, but we're interested in the action of the film advance. I'll just take that film release button off the top, and I'll take that shutter release button off too so we can see what we're about. So if I depress the shutter release, now the film advance has suddenly started to work. That's very interesting because it certainly didn't before. Did you hear that? That was the sound of this popping up. Now, this is our lock. Have a release lever here, and I suspect that that's badly adjusted. Something was causing that to hang up. I'll put the top back on, let's see what we can find out. Put my meter back in place. Put my release lever in place, meter back in place. Check that they're seated. Put the shutter release button back on top. Put the top cover back in place. Make sure it's held down firmly. So that wound all the way till we got to frame number 1, which locked up the film advance, and then we couldn't go any further. So with the top cover in place, the release lever is not allowed, doesn't pop back up, and so doesn't lock the film advance. I'll take my meter off again. What it looks like to me is that this screw is backed right up. We can test that, I think, by just taking the shutter release button off the top. Let's have a look. See what happens. I may have to do more than this. No, so the shutter release button is not being held down by the top of the camera, causing that problem. I'll remove my shutter release button, remove the lock button. I'll pop my meter in place. I'm looking to see if there's clearance between the meter and the top of the release button. There certainly appears to be, but there's not much. So the meter is not holding down this and causing the release shaft to fail to move. Something else is going on. Right, that release lever stuck down. See, it's sticking in the down position. This is the lock lever I've got my finger on. This is the release lever, the one with a screw on it. It's stuck in the down position. There's a problem with that release lever. I wonder if it's got a broken spring on the bottom. Is anything here to fall out? I think everything is comfortably trapped in there. Let's open up the bottom of the camera and have a quick look in here. So I'll start by removing the leatherette patch. This leatherette is crumbly on the advance lever. It's got a very polished look to it. Too many fingers across it in too many years. I'll just put a drop of naphtha under there to soften that adhesive. And that worked very well. Let's have the advanced knob off, the lever off. That is not wanting to come loose. Those screws are just about glued in, I think. Let's try a bigger screwdriver, and if that doesn't do the job, it'll be hammer time. No, that'll do it. The screws holding the tripod sockets around back catch release cover here, those screws are loose, and it's quite likely that the tripod socket is also loose. Doesn't feel too bad. Let's get the leatherette off the base. The adhesive's sticking that quite well. The leatherette seems to be in quite good condition, much better than the leatherette was on the advanced lever. It may mean that this piece has been replaced. I'm going to put a bit of naphtha down under here to soften that adhesive. Be very careful about doing things like that, because if you pour naphtha into a place like that, it could easily run into somewhere where you don't want it to be. It only takes a tiny little bit of naphtha to encourage that adhesive to completely give up the ghost. There's our leatherette off. Let's have a look in here. There's a good number of screws holding this chrome trim on the base of the camera. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're completely invisible on the camera. They're well disguised with glue and dirt and the backing from the leatherette. Now, before you lift the chrome trim on the base of one of these reflexes, be aware that there's a spring under it at this point, a little spring, very light spring, light coil spring, very important and easily overlooked. Okay, so what have we got here? So this is our release lever here, and here is our problem. The release lever should have a spring on the tip which keeps it engaged with the cam on the bottom of the film advance here. That spring is broken. So if we remove that release lever, so what was happening was that the release lever would depress, effectively disengage from the film advance here, allow you to wind on, but then it wouldn't re-engage, and so it wouldn't lock it at the end of the stroke. That tiny little piece of wire there, that looks like part of that spring. It shouldn't be that shape. I've got no idea how it came to look like that, but it's certainly broken. And the remains of it are here. So I've got that off, and that was our spring. And I think that that spring, which you probably can't see, let's put it on here for a bit of contrast. That broken spring was all the cause of our problems. Instead of keeping this engaged with the gear, so that when you pressed on it, it dropped down, followed the cam back out as you rotated the shutter and then popped back up. This wasn't doing anything. It wasn't tracking this gear here at all. This cam, there's a cam here on the top, there's also a cam on the bottom, which controls the action of the film advance. I'll find a spring for this, we'll put it back together and see if the film mechanism works normally. This camera is absolutely filthy and full of sand, so there's no danger I'm leaving it in that state. But we might as well prove what the problem was here with the film advance. Okay, I've found a spring in my spares. See if I can get that hooked into position on this release lever. Well, that's not a very good fit. That must have been for a different model with a slightly bigger stud on it, I think. I don't like the chances of that staying in place, so I'll find another one back shortly. Okay, I found one that'll do the job. Oh, this is terrible. This is really full of sand. Okay, so making sure that this spring is tucked in neatly inside that cavity, not sitting on the top like it wants to there, because that'll only make a mess of it. I'll drop that into position. Now let's put the rest of the camera back together. I'm going to add a little spring. I'll zoom you out a bit, you can't see much here. That spring drops in there, and that is important because that controls the action of the capping plate. Looking at the amount of sand that's in this camera, I am absolutely amazed that it worked as well as it did. Apart from that minor problem of the film advance not stopping once you'd wound on, you could go out and take photos with this camera without any problems at all. The shutter works fairly well. The exposure meter is untested would be the politest thing to say about it. Got no idea how good that is. But it does move, it does react to light. Which means that at least potentially it could be useful. Okay, so that's back on. Let's put our advance lever back on. I should have put this screw on the top of that release lever before I did anything else. That's working entirely normally. Let's put some other bits back in. And the top cover. That doesn't complete the stroke. That tells me that I haven't got the adjustment of that release lever screw quite correct. I'm sure it needs to go in a little bit further. Yep, still more. So basically what's happening is it's pressing that release lever down and causing it to lock up. A little bit more, I believe. This top cover is very good at getting jammed on that meter. I know the top cover's had a hard life in this camera. It may well be somewhat damaged. Now that plastic loop piece of that's broken away. It's probably fallen somewhere to cause me problems. It'd be nice to think it's on the bench, but I can't see it. Okay, the film advance works normally. We wind the film advance once. We can't wind it again without firing the shutter or pressing the film release button. So, all of that problem, and there was that little plastic piece that I mentioned, all of that problem was caused by that tiny broken spring. There it is there. Now, how this piece came to have its end folded over in such an imaginative fashion, I have got no idea. But regardless of that, that was the problem. And that fault could appear on any of the Retinas from the Retina 3C era onwards, basically. They all had a similar arrangement with the release lever, and they all rely on a little wee spring at the end of the tip of the release lever to keep it engaged with the disc on the bottom of the film advance shaft. Right, well, I'll pop this stuff all back together loosely. This camera is going to be, it's going to be a future project.